Welcome back to F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Today we're going to look at the tone, the author's voice, and a little bit at general characterization that we find in The Great Gatsby. So when you look at tone, take a story's temperature by studying it. Is it hopeful? Do you feel it's playful? Is there cynicism? What is in the tone? Well, usually when we're looking at the tone of the story, The Great Gatsby, you gotta look at the main narrator, who is Nick Carraway. Now, Nick Carraway is not the main character of the story, but he is our narrator, and he does take a part in it. So when we look at the tone, we consider it to be cynical and full of irony, because Nick is one cynical little guy. Even though Nick reserves explicit judgment on the characters, our author, Fitzgerald, still manages to implicitly criticize through his narrator's tone. Think about how ludicrous Myrtle seems, and although she's an upper class in Chapter 2, she still tries to look down upon her husband. Now, the characters are sometimes slighted by ironic tone, and we, the readers, are forced to read with the same cynicism that Fitzgerald writes. So even though Nick says he's going to reserve judgment on characters, your author, Fitzgerald, is going to enter a cynicism into his voice. Now, Nick is all too aware of the ridiculousness of certain social circumstances, and he's also aware of the seductive quality of the upper class, even though he feels it's somewhat empty. Nick is able to look at the lower classes and the upper classes from his middle class point of view, and he's able to judge how ridiculous it seems that these two are just that wide apart, and yet everybody wants the same thing, and it's that sense of materialistic emptiness. Now, Nick also has a good grip on what he thinks is righteous or reproachable. He believes he's got the moral values that he was brought up with, and he hands that to his audience as the absolute true judgment of a person or an act. For instance, if you take a look at the last few pages of the novel, when Nick has become disillusioned with his former acquaintances, you're going to hear the cynicism and irony, and at the same time, it's righteous and reproachable. He says in Chapter 9, "I couldn't forgive Tom or like him, but I saw that what he had done was to him entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money, or their vast carelessness, or whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child." So as long as we're talking about tone, let's go ahead and look more at the general characterizations. So when you look at character clues, you're wondering how the author is letting you know who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's the downright ugly. Now, by the time you're through with character clues, you're going to be a regular Sherlock Holmes. So let's look at characterization. The first thing you're going to notice, all important to the characters, is social status or societal position. Because social status is considered a defining quality by the characters in the book, it naturally becomes a means by which you as the reader are going to come to define the characters. Now, Gatsby has money, but he isn't socially in the upper class, and that becomes a dividing line between himself and Daisy, and arguably the blockade on the way to realizing his dreams of having her. Tom is in part defined by his money and therefore his social status, and Daisy is summed up by Gatsby when he simply says, her voice is full of money. Location, the geography itself, could also be part of the characterization. Gatsby lives in West Egg, which is where New Money lives. It's not as socially acceptable as East Egg, where Daisy and Tom reside. That's the more fashionable area because people have inherited their money. People have inherited social position. The difference in location highlights the differences between Jay and Daisy's societal rank. They're both educated, they both knew each other in the past, they both have money, but they're in different societies. It's also worth noting that Jordan, Nick, and Daisy are all in East Egg together, Jordan, Tom, and Daisy are all in East Egg together, while Nick and Gatsby reside together in West Egg. Jordan, Tom, and Daisy don't have to work for a living, whereas Gatsby had to work for his money. Nick is currently working for his money. Now, this division makes sense toward the end of the novel when Nick takes Gatsby's side against the others and calls them a whole rotten crowd. Occupation or jobs also define characterization. Gatsby ends up largely defined by his occupation of bootlegging. There is a stigma carried by this profession because it is technically illegal in the 1920s, and he tries so hard to conceal it. Now, the illegal nature of his job is a constant reminder that Gatsby got to where he is unnaturally, that he doesn't really belong in the high society of New York. Nick, on the other hand, is a bondman. Now, granted, he doesn't have as much money as the others, but it's a straightforward and clean job, and he can become prosperous in it someday. Now, Gatsby insists on introducing Tom as the polo player because Jay defines Tom by his physicality, and Jay expresses his impression of the man by suggesting that Tom's work is of a physical nature. Now, Tom has inherited his money so he can go out and be an athlete just like Jordan Baker can, and Daisy can rely on Tom's money. So occupation is what also defines our characters. Lastly, the speech and the dialogue, the way that your characters talk to one another and the way they present themselves is also part of characterization. And for the most part, the characters in The Great Gatsby are well educated. Their speech and dialogue are going to reflect this education, which in turn reflects wealth and social status. Gatsby tries to sound well educated. He comes from a poorer family, and therefore he spends a lot of time with Dan Cody. He spends a lot of time with Meyer Wolfsheim trying to figure out how, as a wealthy person, you should act and how you should speak. And Nick contends that Gatsby has been practicing his speech. Now, Meyer Wolfsheim, even though he has his money, he speaks in a dialect that indicates his lack of education and lack of class. Now, he does have money, but he came by it unnaturally as well. And so wealthy, snobby people in the 1920s might say he doesn't have good breeding. Now, the use of different dialects works to reveal the differences between the working class, people like Gatsby, Meyer Wolfsheim, and Nick, and the upper class, people like Jordan and Tom and Daisy. Thanks so much for stopping by my channel, guys, and learning more about F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. If you'd like to learn more about Great Gatsby, why don't you check out my playlist? I've done lots of summaries, and I've done lots of effort with the motifs, the themes. Check out the playlist. It's pretty complete. If you'd like to learn more about other stories, please let me know in the comments, leave a like, and of course, as always, if you could subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate it. Thanks for stopping by.